Australian letters across many forms. So would you join me in welcoming the panellists tonight? So I thought I might begin by asking each of the panellists, how are things at the moment? What is the current state of Australian literature as they see things? How are things out there right now? It's been a very difficult period in Australian culture across many art forms. Of course, the performing arts have had really a 100-year crisis with the pandemic and very, very significant disruptions to really all forms of the performing arts. But writing and publishing has certainly not escaped either. There's been a very difficult period for this sector too. So I might begin. I might ask Claire. I'm going to have to pass her the mic because we're passing the mic tonight.
Thank you, Ben, and I'd like to also offer my respects to the elders, past and present, and those emerging here on Wurundjeri land. I work currently as a literary agent. I bring experience from Australia's trade publishing industry, covering from University of Queensland Press to HarperCollins to Penguin Random House, and I've been fortunate to work with lots of wonderful Australian writers across every kind of book, children's, poetry, gardening, fiction, history, science. We have an extraordinary population of creators, including illustrators, and many of these writers find audiences around the world with their works translated or acquired in the English language, but struggle to make a bare living. They struggle to make a bare living. Henri Matisse said that creativity requires courage. It also requires money for the rent, school uniforms, food to put in lunchboxes, funds to pay the ever-rising utility bills, and to preserve one's basic dignity while offering so much to Australian society. I think we all have heard the statistic, which is, almost a truism and true, that most Australian writers, people who would regard themselves as professional writers, earn about $4,000 a year. So I'm hoping that we might hear from Emily as a working and highly acclaimed writer, how that impacts the daily life of an Australian writer. And I'm hoping that going forward, our government can work with the industry, with writers and illustrators themselves, to create better pathways for these extraordinary talents who enrich our lives so much from so little, and who we need to support.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. There's no, I'll try and speak up. It's for the streaming. I guess I've probably got two hats that I will speak from. One is, I guess, just being a working writer, and I think I've probably been lucky comparatively compared to a lot of my peers in terms of the support that I have received, and the my first novel was sold internationally, and that really enabled me to kind of write the second book. But it's really tough. I basically sort of wrote my first novel by doing a creative writing PhD with a small scholarship, and that sort of allowed me to write that with a small amount of income. And then after that was published, I sort of thought, okay, well, how do I write the next one? And it's tough. I sort of juggle. I co-own a bar in Carlton that I was working 90 hours a week in while I started writing the second novel. And even though I did sort of receive a bigger than average probably advance on the second one, because largely because I won the Stella Prize for the first book. I sort of crunched the numbers at some point, and I probably got paid less than $5 an hour for the actual labour that went into writing the second book over 5 years, which is how long it took me. And then the other thing I just kind of wanted to mention was I was recently a peer assessor for the Australia Council Literature funding round, the most recent one. And that really, it was quite disheartening as a, both as a writer myself and just as a member of the community. And I think the thing that I really noticed was that a lot of the individual writers that were applying for funding were applying for that sort of second or third book, which is just it's a very tough transition, I think, to make from being a debut writer to trying to work out how to sort of fund that second or third book. And I think there were something like over 80 applications that I read. That was only one half of the pool, and that was both individuals and groups. And we were told that around 9 out of the entire pool would get funding, and I don't think any of the individual novelists actually secured funding in that round. So I think, just as a writer, my response to that was, well, I probably won't even bother applying for funding because it takes a lot of time and effort to kind of put those applications together, and the odds are just so slim. So that's my position, and yet I will continue because artists are dogged, and I guess that's why we continue to find ways to fund ourselves.
Thank you, Emily. Yes, of course we will continue. We're suckers, aren't we? Yeah. I'm Peter Rose. Thank you for the welcome. Ben, I'm here wearing, I suppose, a few hats as someone who's published a few books in different genres, but basically I think here as a publisher, the editor and CEO of Australian Book Review. And first I want to congratulate David Latham and Ben Eltham for their work in this cause and in creating From the Arts. It's close to our hearts at Australian Book Review, and my chair and Emily's friend Sarah Holland-Batt and I were right behind it. The magazine is right behind it because of its importance and happily playing something of an ambassadorial role as best we can. I very much commend to you Ben Eltham's article in today's conversation. It makes lamentable reading, but my God, it's important, and I'd circulate it. I think it's close to a disgraceful story, and one we need really now to take seriously. And I think almost there's a feeling now, gloves off. Enough is enough. I think the literary sector has been screwed now for decades, really, and it's time something was noted, and we have a perfect opportunity during what's going to be a very lively election campaign to do so. I think this low level of funding reflects very poorly on successive governments of both hue. I also think, and that's something we may touch on later, I don't think it actually reflects well on the literary sector in terms of its collective will or its powers of advocacy. But maybe that's an argument for another time. I think it's very clear to those of us who watched with dismay the recent drift that the dismantling of the individual art forms. Not all of you will know the politics of the Australia Council, but I think it was under a Labor government in 2012, something, the individual art form boards were dismantled. It's perfectly clear now was a complete disaster, because with it, those art forms were robbed of the boards were populated by senior-most people in those particular art forms, and with them went a lot of influential lobbying and advocacy from senior people. The facts before us, that Ben's outlined, are stark and really irrefutable. And it's such a paradox because by any measure, Australian literature is one of the cultural strengths of this country. We can trot out those figures compared with, say, dear old Australian cinema, immensely well funded, 7% or something of tickets sold are for Australian films. We know that something like, when I last heard, 60% of books sold in places like this, great readings, and fantastic of them to host this event, are written by Australian authors. This is not a failed sector. It's one that's responsible for the employment of thousands of people. It generates tens of millions of dollars, and yet to see the proportion of money spent invested in literature via the Australia Council for the Arts is just completely bewildering. I've been around working in the sector for a long time now. I was a publisher at OUP throughout the 1990s. The Australia Council budget for literature in the 1990s was $5 million. It's just under $5 million now, 30 years on. I mean, this is staggering. It should be known. It should be talked about. It should be pilloried, really. It's impossible to disagree with Ben Eltham when he says, when it comes to public funding, literature has long been the poor cousin of the arts. I must say that nothing I've seen in recent years from the major political parties convinces me that they're willing to overturn in a dramatic and substantive way this anomalous funding reality. Clearly here, new momentum, new forces, new agitation, new alliances, new stratagems are needed. And I'm hoping that the arts sector will help elect more sympathetic and enlightened independents into Parliament who will know how to exert influence in the ways that we see other independents behave in recent governments to striking effect. This seems to me now to be the only way that that these anomalous underfundings in federal budgets will be overturned. In his article, Ben makes the point, one that conservative governments particularly would like to refute, that this is a strikingly wealthy country with a massive economy and huge federal budgets, and the shrinkage of expenditure on literature just is shaming at a time when enormous amounts of money are pumped into other areas of federal activity. When you look at Ben's article, just concentrate on the chapter about the neglect of the National Library. That alone disgraces that budget. I mean, if there is one, if you believe in the life of the mind and the future of the book and the importance of cultural literacy, one thing really is important in Canberra, it's the National Library, and those figures are just staggering. Finally, I'll just note that I'm here representing, I suppose, magazines. In recent rounds, because of the reduction in funding available for literature, it's become more and more competitive. They, of course, would say this is a wonderful thing, isn't it? The amount of time one spends on these applications, especially in multi-year ones, is staggering. Probably a month of our time in a tiny little outfit went into putting in those applications. And nowadays, as Emily has mentioned, the success rates are really, really minute. And yet, I think, well, I would say that, wouldn't I, defending literary magazines, but I think they do play an important role in the literary ecology. And one of our roles at the magazine, apart from publishing good journalism, is to introduce a lot of new talent, creative and critical, the reviewers who will be then drawn to the attention of people like Claire and publishers and booksellers and readers. And to do that, they need support, especially if we're going to, we endeavour to pay writers properly. And to go on doing so, literary magazines can't be screwed out of existence. And for all these reasons, I commend Ben's article and the work of the cause and hope you'll get behind it. Thank you.
Well, very, very encouraging comments there from Peter. I thank you very much. I'm a little bit embarrassed. I think it's an excellent point you make about the value of particularly small literary publishers in the landscape. If you think about the way in which really important writers in the Australian literary sphere have come to the attention of readers through some of those magazines, we can all think of well-known writers who really got their start in small publications. I can think of writers such as Anwyn Crawford, Evelyn Orlin. There's a swag of people that have been able to cut their teeth in these smaller publications, and there isn't a lot of funding, unfortunately, as sort of detailed in my article in the conversation today. Look, I feel like we're in disagreement that things aren't going so well. I think one of the things I wanted to ask the panel is why should we support literature more? What is it that we gain from having a rich national literary life? What is it that is of value here, not just for writers, although that's obviously important, but for readers as well? And perhaps I'll go around the panel again.
Thank you, Ben. I think we define ourselves in many ways, and a really key way is stories. The stories we tell about ourselves, that we tell to ourselves, that we tell others, and that we ask others to tell us. It's how we find out more about our experiences. Here in Australia, we're in a powerful era of truth-telling, uncovering, justice-seeking, and I have the privilege, and many in our industry are seeking out opportunities to work with First Nations voices. So to get the opportunity to publish something like Archie Roach's Took the Children Away in a beautiful new edition for children, illustrated by his late partner Ruby Hunter's illustrations, which were the last thing she was painting before she died. The paint was wet when she died. These are opportunities that really are stumped up by, at this point, the willingness of unpaid artists, advocates, editors, publishers. The printers get paid. And we know that just those essential elements, by the way, speaking of print and paper, this is an industry which has been hit by costs that have risen 30-40%. Paper, freight, even scheduling your book. There are all these tight pressures on making such a book happen, but who can deny that that's such a worthwhile and beautiful book to make? And it's available here if you'd like to buy a copy and take it to the to the counter. But these are some of the reasons why I think Australian literature is so vital, and that's not even to begin with the things that words on paper can spark off in terms of songs, musicals, films, TV series, as well as changing the way we think. So I'll pass on to Emily now.
Thank you. I think this is a very big question, but I guess from my personal perspective as a reader, my background is, even though I did do a PhD in creative writing, my background before that was in studying literature, and that was because essentially I am an incredibly passionate reader, and I don't know anyone that is not constantly consuming stories in various forms, whether it's on Netflix or in music or books. But I think, particularly now in Australia, we are probably more likely to be consuming stories that are produced elsewhere. And I think it's really, really important that, we're also exposed to stories that are produced here and that are about Australia and that are about, where we live, the things that are relevant to this particular place. And not just Netflix. And I think that's a really, really vital thing that those stories are given the kind of prominence so that they can find their way to readers. And it's a battle, I think, to get into the hands of readers these days, with so many alternatives coming at people constantly. But to me, I guess just in my own experience, those stories have been absolutely invaluable in terms of just thinking about life and the place that we live and what are the important things, and my life would be a lot less rich without those books and those stories that I have consumed since childhood. Yeah.
I think Emily touches on something really significant there, talking about the potent competition of things like streaming and whatever. We live in a culture now where there is such diversity and so many alternatives that didn't say exist when I was growing up and consuming books in my adolescence. We live in a country with an immensely powerful and wealthy popular culture sector. The sporting world, we don't need to talk about it, the immense audience it consumes, the amount of money that is sucked into the world of AFL and cricket and other forms. And yet it's really worth remembering that in a country with a tiny population, for 100 years, the literature has been significant and estimable and consumed overseas in terms of, say, the performing arts, theatre, but particularly, say, in music and opera, which is a form that I love, and I review opera in the magazine. Australia has always fought above its weight, and certainly does in literature, and that is noted. And I don't need to mention the work of the mid 20th century masters, the Wrights and Patrick Whites and Stows, and their influence, and then succeeded in recent years, and now by this extraordinary effusion of Indigenous literature that we're seeing that is carrying right around the world. But I'd compare it, say, with, we've got a fantastic operatic history in this country. We know how much money has been found before COVID for the national carrier, the National Opera Company, over $20 million year in, year out. Good on them. Fantastic. And during COVID, topped up very nicely by that Rise Fund by, I think, another $3 million or whatever. No such top-ups were available to literature, and that's, I've mentioned the word paradox earlier in the evening, and I think this is paradoxical, but there's no denying, I think, on economic terms and in terms of quality, the contribution our literature has made internationally.
I once had a conversation with my colleague Julian Merrick, who's these days a professor up at Griffith University, and we were talking about how you can never sort of predict when an art form is going to suddenly just get hot. And he was talking about, who would have thought that independent dance would become like the biggest thing in Melbourne for a period there. And he was right. I mean, we had an incredible efflorescence of of particularly contemporary dance in Melbourne. And I think we're actually in one of those moments right now in Australia for First Nations writing, and particularly for First Nations poetry. It's an extraordinary moment with some, I think, actually really world historic work being published. But I think it points to what all of the panellists here tonight have spoken about, which is the vibrancy of Australian literary culture, despite the relatively austere funding environment. So let me then ask the panellists, how can things be better? What are some of the things that the three of you concretely would like to see improve, perhaps in terms of policy for the sector, or perhaps just simply in terms of the way in which we treat writers and readers as a nation?
I knew I shouldn't have sat here, but what? Well, look, all right. In my greatest hopes and highest aspirations, Ireland is looking at a living wage for artists. Could we do that? I dare to think this movement has really encouraged, Fund the Arts has really encouraged me to start thinking, okay, what are the possibilities? I hope others will feel similarly inspired. So just a little thing like living wages for artists. I would like to see greater support for the published work of our writers and illustrators to reach other territories through funding for translation schemes. These are commonplace in other literary cultures and arts funding around the world. But again, I hear from publishers overseas that they don't bother applying because I think maybe one annually. I could be wrong on that figure, but very few annually are able to be funded from the poverty-stricken budgets that the Australia Council has allocated. Number 3, Emily will tell us about.
Yes, I think obviously more funding and support would be wonderful. I think something that kind of comes to mind for me is just a shift in the way that the general culture sort of thinks about the arts and its worthiness for support and funding. I think, and I tend to be guilty of this myself. I think there's something about being a solo writer that, we were talking about this, why is the literary industry so bad at sort of advocating for itself? And I think, it's harder to kind of push for yourself when you're a solo producer than it would be, say, as part of a theatre company or a film crew or whatever it is, when you're sort of pushing for other people as well. And I often sort of just find myself meekly sort of thinking, well, this is the field I've chosen. I just have to sort of slave away and work in a bar to kind of make ends meet and all of those things. And then I sort of think, I can't help sometimes if I think about the way that sport is valued and given so much kind of support in our society, and no one kind of questions the fact that, if there's a young, talented sports person, that they are taken and kind of given support to rise up, to a professional level. They're given sponsorship, any sort of prizes and things like that they win tax-free. Whereas, even if you get a small Australia Council grant, that's still taxable income.
And
most prizes, yeah. And I think the shift has to be a really culture-wide one to, I think, encourage people to think about culture on the same, and literature on the same sort of level as, say, sport. I know it's a kind of slightly cliched example, but why not really what is so much less worthy about artists than sport people to kind of receive that same support from, not just kind of financially, but from the culture in general, I guess.
Yeah, it's always worth noting that I think I'm right in saying this. The only graduates in Australia who do not have to repay their HECS are graduates of the Institute of Sport in Canberra, many of whom enjoy, lavish sponsorship. And really, those of you who know your AFL know that a battling halfback flanker for Carlton who can't get a kick is paid about $200,000 or $300,000 a year. There is a little bit of a disconnect here. Emily's talked about attitudinal change. I actually don't think I think from my observation as a writer, as someone attending recently the Writers' Week, a fantastic one in Adelaide, is that that writers command due, not slavish one hopes, but due respect from public audiences. Mike would have seen that at endless sessions here. There's great regard. I think where the attitudinal change really needs to come from more conservative forces. We're not in as desperate a situation as the United States, where Trump and his supporters set out to close down the Arts Endowment, the federal. Which is a pitiful budget, even in comparison with the Australian one. But we seem to me to be going down that path, whether that's because of a distrust of presumed left liberal tendencies. But that seems to me the path. That's where I think one of the significant changes comes down. But at a practical level, what will lead to more efficient outcomes and embolden individual artists and organisations such as the one that I lead is an urgent injection of federal funds into the budget for the Australia Council. No alternative to that, really. Time's up if that doesn't happen soon, because the odds are becoming so slim. And as with, the ARC, which has been mentioned tonight, one hears from scholar colleagues who seem to spend their whole summer putting in these applications with next to no expectation of success, but an obligation from their universities. And we're now approaching that point when organisations say, ABR has a staff of 5. In the Australian context, that feels like they're New Yorker compared with those organisations that might have 1 or 2. But for many of these organisations now, the expectations of mounting a full application, a business plan, are just kind of absurd. They can't be justified in a business model. These governments talk about efficiencies, but this is not an efficient way of going about engaging organisations that are meant to be doing creative stuff, and not the expectations on artists and organisations to become bureaucrats is ever greater. And if they want that, then I think they've got to give a reasonable chance of success to justify such a label, which distracts from the core work of writing the next novel or the next poem.
Now, I think we've got time for a little bit of questioning time. So, yeah, we'll do the raving mic thing. So, yes, excellent. Well done.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And a couple of things. I am a voter in Kooyong, so I'm very interested at seeing the political parties here. First of all, I'm an aspiring writer, have come into the field very late because, like most people, I couldn't afford to write. And now I don't fantasize ever to make a living out of writing. But what I want is grants and mentorship and prizes to just get me on the shelf. So that's one of the things we talked about, what we need. That's what we need. And the other thing is the question about why literature is important. I mean, the pandemic had us locked up. Books are accessible. So if we are to keep together as a social, the texture of social life, books are very important.
Thank you, everyone. It was a very rich and sort of diverse. There's sort of so many things to tackle. But I had two main points, so I guess provocations. And the first one, and it's really interesting that two of you are either in academia or have, quite extensive experience of it. And I wonder if whether the focus on putting money into the arts or funding the arts risks making the problem much more parochial than it actually is, insofar as, to put it bluntly, it's quite easy to defund the National Library if you're not going to fund library sciences, if you have no librarians, if you have no people who are actually going to be archivists or historians or literary critics to actually go and use that resource. So the whole question of funding the arts, and to get to that point that I think Emily made about that attitudinal change, is also about this being bound up with the under-resourcing of education. Like, it seems to me those are very much two pieces of the same picture. But to sort of press down further on that question about the attitudinal change, and to go back to what Peter was saying about the kind of lack of the weak advocacy that the arts have had. I mean, part of the problem, I imagine, and this is where I guess, Ben, you might be able to give us some insight, has to do with low rates of unionization, right? It must be one of the least unionized. I mean, for reasons that Emily pointed out, like there are a lot of kind of people working on their own, so kind of, structurally that's a problem. But certainly, I mean, one of the reasons why I guess it's easy to get paid as a printer is because there is that kind of broader corporate sense. And maybe one of the attitudinal changes that needs to be enacted is not thinking about writers and performers as these entrepreneurs, as if we're living in the Renaissance, but instead of the Medicis, you have the Australia Council, right? But thinking about writers and artists as workers, and that being bound up with that question of the visibility of this being a coherent or corporate labor force. Sorry.
Hi everyone, thanks for the chat. It was really great and wonderful to hear your thoughts. I have a question, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, but when you're speaking about how there's that attitudinal response to the arts and funding, and obviously you're talking about Australia, and then there was a reference to Trump, and I just wonder, and I'm aware that there's such a cultural cringe in Australia, and we have this sense of, and which is well founded, that we don't value the arts. How do you place that in a global context? Do you think that there are examples overseas where there is a kind of, obviously not a utopian vision where countries, worship at the altar of the arts, but there perhaps are better examples? Is this uniquely Australian? Or can you think of examples where perhaps the arts are really valued in contemporary sort of life? And I have to give it to somebody. So thank you.
We just had three, so let me just try to frame that. So we've just had three questions. Would any of the panel like to answer any of the questions? That's what I've got to say. Okay, well, I'll hand over to Peter.
And just very briefly, I don't know about the Germany's attitude towards literature. I'd be surprised if it wasn't enlightened, but certainly in terms of the performing arts, it's staggering. And the amount of money that the Merkel regime found during those 2 years was deeply impressive.
And 50 billion euros.
Yeah,
wow.
yeah.
Seriously.
And in addition to already opulent budgets, but then there are many, and until recently, I'd be in sessions where we would kind of extol government's support for the arts because it compares well, say, with Britain and certainly with the United States. When you look at them, and just very briefly touching on an earlier comment, I think one of the problems is a stubborn Philistine attitude that writers, artists of any kind, but particularly writers, we're hobbyists. We're hobbyists, and lovely, you publish a short story or a poem in a magazine, isn't that nice and whatever, but that it's not really professional, it's not really entrepreneurial, and I think that's the problem. And one of the things that always struck me for many years, I've been editor for a long time at ABR, we get a lot of people coming through our doors looking for work, and I'd be struck by the fact that they two questions when they politely seeking work and whatever, and we give them as much work for that. Two questions they don't ask. They don't ask, will you be edited? And that's what we're there for. But more importantly, they don't ask, will I be paid? Will I be paid? And I realised in the end, of course, we pay everyone we publish. We pay as well as we can. We pay $70 per 100 words now for freelance writers. Those rates are going up. But and so I thought, that's the first thing I say to them. By the way, you will be paid. And the depressing thing was, I realised that they had no expectation when they came in that they'd be paid. And they think, oh, that's they're pleasantly surprised. And that's our predicament, that when we're as kind of polite and cowed as that, that's why I talk about a lack of, I think, strong advocacy from the seniors, people who've been around the block and who can exert a bit of influence. I think we've been lacklustre in supporting those people who are in their 20s or late teens or whatever, are just passionate about books, and they're the ones who need support, and we need to get better, I think, at bolstering them.
I think we are, yes. Yes. Going to close the shop. So, yes, we have 3 candidates for the seat of Kooyong. So, I would like, in no particular order, to invite those candidates to come up and give a little spiel in relation to the topic of tonight's session. So, may I invite to begin with Dr. Monique Ryan, the independent candidate for this seat. Thank you very much for being here.
It's not okay. Just for the okay. Thank you for having me. It's been very interesting. It's just I'm a medical doctor and scientific researcher, but we do have a collection of books in the campaign office published by members of the campaign. Mine's the biggest. It's about that big. And as a paediatric neurologist and specialist in obscure genetic nerve and muscle disorders, it's been read by about 50 people, most of whom have contributed a chapter. So I think I've made several $100s out of it over the course of its life. So I do feel your pain. Look, it's really interesting. I was really struck listening to you guys. I was wondering, I'm a reader and very much engaged with the arts, and have been really concerned. Don't get dropped on the head by that.
Good spotting.
Concerned by the evisceration of the arts and literature and all of the universities by the current government over the last 9 years, and the last 2 years have, as they probably have in the arts and literature, exposed what was there before but has become more apparent, I guess, with the stresses on the system. It's very clear that the arts and literature in particular need more support. I've got lots of friends who are writers and playwrights or theatre directors and things, and they've all had an extremely difficult time in the last couple of years. I do wonder, listening to you, if perhaps a louder voice at the table would be more effective. I was really, I'm sure the other guys are the same. I was about, I've become a politician 2 months ago, and about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I received about 300 emails on a single issue, which was Aboriginal, Indigenous ranges. Peter's nodding. Piers, you would have got them too? Hundreds of emails about this thing. I was like, never heard of it. What's this? What's this? And it basically was a pressure group trying to get more funding for Indigenous ranges, which is a good initiative, but there's lots of good initiatives. And I did notice that there was a massive amount of money allocated to them. They'd already got secured an assurance of funding from the ALP if they got up, and they got a massive amount of funding in the budget the other day. And I thought, no, isn't that interesting? Because they've got, I don't know who pushed that, but someone pushed it very effectively. This massive sort of pressure on all the people in that space for a period of time, and they got the answer that they wanted. Presumably they paid someone to do that for them. I do wonder if people in literature, and I don't mean to generalise, but you might be introverts who tend to go off and do your own thing by yourselves, and perhaps not advocate as effectively as a group on your own behalf as you could, and maybe you could do with some help with that. As an independent, if I am elected to federal parliament as part of a group, or by myself, or as part of a group of people with the balance of power, I'd be very much committed to, assisting to whatever extent I could with, an increase in funding for the arts. I don't have a detailed policy platform on that. I have signed the MEAA pledge already. I think it's really, really important. I think it's important for our country and for our academic life that we pay more than lip service to the importance of literature and the arts and all forms of creative pursuit. But I don't have much more than that. But I think, you have a really important case to make. I do wonder if perhaps it would be, if you could prosecute that case a bit more aggressively. You're probably too nice as a group. Peter?
Yeah, we'll hand over. Yes, Peter.
Thank you. 3 minutes or 5? Or just you'll keep me
Two,
Two,
and you.
two, yeah, two to three.
2 to 3. So thanks very much for your invitation. I've listened carefully to what everyone said, and I've really enjoyed it. Now, look, I want to say, and thank you for your comments, which I'll actually come to too. Look, I want to come to architecture and structure, and that sounds a bit bureaucratic, but I think some of you, I might be older than just about anyone here, so I actually remember how a lot of this started. And the Whitlam government actually set up an Australian Council type model, and it's very interesting from a medical research point of view, because there's a lot of, in some ways to us, we can see some similarities. So I'm so old that it's gone so many times between Australian Council, specific boards, Australian Council, it's just multiple times. But the principle's incredibly important, and it's a principle that's been torn apart by this government, So grants for funding needs to be expertly assessed, whether it's research, whether it's arts. It needs to be assessed by peers.
At arm's length.
Not by bureaucrats, and certainly not by an individual minister. And that is what this government's gone from the word go. Now, if you gave me more time, I'd love to talk about the whole history of Labor, history's support of the arts. But you're not going to give me that, or the shop's not going to stay open long enough. But Labor, I would put to you that Labor hasn't been in government since the Abbott government was elected in 2013. There was a strong arts policy under the Keating government called Creative Nation. Some people thought it was over the top. And the last Labor government, the policy was called Creative Australia. Now, Labor actually had an arts department. It's this government that removed the word arts. Removed the word arts from the bureaucracy. Removed it. At the time, I must confess, at the time I've seen so many bureaucratic rearrangements, I didn't actually think it was that important, but in retrospect, I think it was incredibly important. It was very symbolic of their approach. So they immediately attacked that architecture. I just briefly go back to how the way this government came in. Tony Abbott stood there under umbrella, no cuts to the ABC, no cuts to the SBS. The very first budget, they cut the SBS, they cut the ABC, they cut the Australia Council. And not only did they cut it, they restructured it. They took $100 million out of it. And George Brandis put it into something he called his Catalyst Fund. So, like the name. But immediately this principle, taking it out of the peer group, out of the expert group, and into an arbitrary group. And it's so ironical that having now is so much similarities with some of the other aspects of this government's approach to this minister, Paul Fletcher, is the Minister for Infrastructure and Arts is put with infrastructure. And it's the same approach that they took in 2019 to sports projects, now labelled sports routes, and commuter car parks. So totally arbitrary and totally decided by non-peer group experts and so on and so forth. Now, I heard your comments. I would encourage you and all to spend 10 or 20 minutes on Tony Burke's website. He's the Shadow Minister for the Arts, and he'll be the Arts Minister in an incoming government. He literally lost his voice. He's got COVID, so he can't speak. I was in touch with his office today, and I actually listened to a lot of his speeches and read them today. He's coming along. And so many of these points he's actually made. So firstly, he's, at several speeches, has acknowledged the importance of your work, what you said, in COVID. So, I wanted to talk about pre-COVID and COVID. So take what I said as part of the COVID. So pre-COVID, this government had already attacked the structures. had moved away from Australia Council peer group funding, and created something, I love this, called RISE, the RISE funding system. Restart, Investment, Sustain and Expand. And this is bureaucrats deciding arts grants and putting it through to the minister. So, again, terrible. So COVID was very important. I would put to you that Tony Burke was a good advocate for workers. He says he argued, and I think he did, argued with the government to recognise that arts people are actually workers, your point. They actually work. And that the industry was, because of COVID, put on the rugs. Okay. I'm sure that... Pardon?
We've got to fit gears.
We need to hear from our next speaker.
I'm stopping. I'm winding up here. Yeah, no, I want to get So look, I'm sure the formal policy will be announced in the election campaign. There will be a return to some sort of normality, shall we say, where there's respect for arts council type approaches, peer group, and please have a look at and listen to Tony Burke's speeches because they're great.
Thanks, Peter. We've got just a little bit of time for Piers. Thank you, Piers Mitchum. I'm sorry that you got left to last. That was not intentional. It's just how it works. But go for it.
That's quite okay. Thank you. Is this for amplification or is this for the...
It's for the recording.
Oh, for the recording.
For the recording,
okay.
yes.
All right.
It's for posterity.
I'll persevere. Look, I'll be very quick, but conceptually the Greens approach the arts in general and the role of government therein is to support, the role of government is to support the arts as an essential and indispensable part of public life and the public good. I think that probably sums up what the problem might be today in terms of the government's current approach to those matters. The approaching the arts on the basis solely on economic rationalisation and its financial output to the community, I think really does the entire industry a gross disservice, and it shows probably an ideological issue with government, but also a fundamental misunderstanding of the value that your industry provides to Australia, both culturally and economically, and the value that it provides is grossly disproportionate to the amount of funding that the industry receives. That's what I believe personally, but that's also the Greens' approach to it as well. In that respect, sorry, I'll just check my notes. Yeah, in that respect, I mean, the Greens approach that as it's just an unacceptable situation. What happened during JobKeeper with JobKeeper and JobSeeker, that for the Arts Centre was also unacceptable. There were so many people that were closed out of the necessary funding that they really needed to see. And I think to summarise that, I think there are many people in the arts sector and in writing and literature who have probably survived in spite of government policy rather than because of it. And I think, Emily, some of the examples that you gave very early on really made that very clear. And the industry absolutely deserves a lot more support and input than it currently receives from the government. The Greens have a lot to say. I think calling ourselves the Greens is a bit of a misnomer because we do have a lot to say about arts and arts funding, but one of the main policy platforms that we're taking to the election is to address the RISE funding and the funding levels, and I know that is being kind of phased out by the end of the current financial year. But we want to see that properly funded so that any grant applicant to that program who satisfies the necessary criteria is eligible for a grant. Okay, so at the moment, I think the estimate was that we needed 100 million in grants provided, say, and about 17 million was actually flowed through to the sector. It's just not enough, and there needs to be a lot more. So that's one area that we would absolutely focus on. The second is the Australia Council. So I know the Australia Council received about $220 million allocated in funding in the most recent budget. That's a very meagre increase on the previous financial year. It's not enough. We say it should be doubled. And that's not a big ask. We spend a lot more locking people up on distant islands. It's not a big ask, and we can make a substantial difference by doing that. And look, I'm conscious of the time, so I think there are also broader measures that we can address that can really help the literature and arts sector generally. And I'm talking about things like insecure employment, ensuring free childcare, right, so people can go back to work, superannuation during periods of parental leave is critical. And there's been mention of collective bargaining, and I think increasing the powers so that you can bargain on an industry-wide level would be critical to increasing wages. So, look, I'll finish it up there, but there've been comments made about the importance that literature provides. I can't imagine Australia without a vibrant and incredible arts sector, but also in particular literature. I just can't. And if we don't support this industry, you know, it might be filled by the likes of Jordan Peterson will fill the empty space, and I wouldn't want to see that happen. So thanks for everything you do, and we certainly hope we can speak for you.
Well, thank you very much to our three candidates tonight for speaking on this important topic. Look, I'm very pleased to wrap up tonight's discussion. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you for your engagement, for your interesting questions, and thank you again to our panellists. They've been fantastic. Can you join me in a round of applause for Claire, Emily, and Peter? And before you go, can I encourage you all to buy an Australian book or magazine? We have a Stellar Prize-winning novelist here. You might want to get one of her books and get it signed. There's lots and lots of stuff you can do. ABR, yes.
And just on that, if I may, the April issue is on sale. With Mike's permission, David Latham, with input, I'm sure, from Ben, wrote about the Fund the Arts campaign in the March issue. They're sitting there, and feel free to take one. A copy.
And also thank you to our tech crew from RMI TV. Really appreciate it. And of course, thank you to Mike and Readings Hawthorne. And check out the Fund the Arts website too. Thank you, everyone.